Record. Great. Okay. Welcome back to Religion in Conversation. It has been a little while since our last conversation, as many of you tuning in, many of you working in universities will know, sometimes the responsibilities of the institutional machine have a way of pulling us away from the very things that brought us to academic life in the first place, such as ideas, books, people, and conversation. The absence certainly hasn't been for lack of extraordinary people to speak with, I can assure you. We are remarkably fortunate here in Australia to have such a rich and diverse community of scholars working across religion and the study of religion, across traditions, disciplines, histories, and ways of thinking. And part of the purpose of Religion in Conversation, of course, has always been to make a little more room for those voices and those conversations. So on this beautiful day from this ancient and timeless land, a land whose human stories reach back into a time almost beyond our imagining, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to Religion in Conversation. And I couldn't think of a better way to return with today's guest, Dr. Elizabeth McDougal. Now, a little bit of by way of introduction, I'm of course joined today by Dr. Elizabeth McDougal to discuss her book Tantric Meditation in Context. Now, I'm going to share the cover of her book, which I think should be showing. It is, in my view at least, a remarkable and deeply immersive study of a Tibetan Buddhist nuns community and their contemplative world. What makes this work so compelling is that it is not simply a study of meditation techniques, but an exploration of an entire way of life, a way of knowing shaped by embodied practice, devotion, community, and the cultivation of non-dual awareness within a living tradition. The book challenges many modern assumptions about meditation, knowledge, and even what we mean by learning, showing us a world in which wisdom is cultivated not primarily through theory, but through practice, ritual, devotion, and lived experience. Now, Elizabeth, I want to thank you deeply so much for the time that you've given and for joining me today. But before I turn over to you with a question, I do want to give our audience, our everyone tuning in, a little bit of your biography. Dr. McDougal is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism whose research focuses on Tantric Buddhist practice, contemplative traditions, and lived religious experience, particularly within Himalayan and Tibetan communities. Her work combines textual scholarship with ethnographic fieldwork and with particular attention to embodied knowledge, devotion, subtle body practices, and the cultivation of non-dual awareness in Vajrayana traditions. Her book, Tantric Meditation in Context, makes an important contribution to the study of meditation, Tibetan Buddhism, and contemplative traditions more broadly, as I understand it. Now, Elizabeth, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to jump right into asking you my first question about your book. And the first one is meditation in context. And let me stop sharing so people can probably focus on us. If they're watching or listening, they can listen. Here we go. Elizabeth, so meditation in context. Would you be kind enough to perhaps begin with the central idea of the book? So one of the things that struck me very strongly is that you're not really studying meditation as a technique, if I'm not mistaken, but meditation as part of an entire world, a culture, community, way of life, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what you mean by studying tantric meditation in context and why that context is essential.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I will do my best, and I appreciate you having me here, Milad, and also the format of your Religion and Conversation podcast, because you started out by saying how time is so rare in academia, more and more so, but to take the time, to stay committed to the questions and take the time to do that, I think is something I really appreciate, and I'm sure your listeners do too. So the question you've just asked, I think, nowadays, sort of when you look at most research, what we're doing is contextualizing.
Mm.
We're appreciating that things exist in context, and to try and look at them outside of context is a faulty way of seeing. And so I would say that the book, if it's an argument, it's a methodological one. So I would say that I was studying meditation, but I wasn't studying it in the manner of perhaps classical philology, like at least in Buddhist studies, what we might call classical philology. So up until the late 20th century, it was sort of kind of the rule that you would stay devoted to the text and to participate culturally and through mediums of faith and devotion and cultural participation could obscure the scholar's ability to understand the meaning of the text. So if anybody's done that, and it might be a bit extreme to define classical philology in that way, but there certainly was a trend there. So the ethnography that I based my book on would argue on the contrary that that's really a mistake, particularly when we're looking at religious texts from contemplative traditions. And so this book is about a Tibetan Buddhist nunnery from, Vajrayana Buddhist nunnery from the Nyingma school, which is a very practice-based tradition. So their highest principle of learning would be pith oral instructions of qualified masters, and their learning goal is that embodied non-conceptual awareness. In the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, this is called Rigpa, but it's understood to be kind of non-conceptual and very much embodied. It's not an idea, it's something that's whole person. And so to understand that, I just sort of tried my best to take a holistic approach to literally be contextual in the way I asked the questions. So I looked at the texts, I looked at the life world. I looked at the history of the nunnery. I looked at the founding, because it has its own corpus. It has its own 16 volumes that is distinct to its tradition and that the nuns base their tradition of learning upon. So I looked at the writing of those 16 volumes. I looked at how the nuns read them, how they learn to read, how they make meaning from the text, and then I actually looked at the words of the text themselves in the context of the nunnery's learning tradition. So, it never really gets you inside the experience of the nun's understanding, but for me, I experimented with that as a contextual practice. Rather than appreciating its contextual, I tried to be contextual in asking the question.
Okay. So that kind of leads naturally into my next question about the ways of knowing. So in terms of how, this is a theme that runs throughout your work, the nuns that you studied, then they're not, as you're saying, they're not necessarily scholars or intellectuals, as we might say.
Mhm.
But they possess nevertheless, they possess a very sophisticated philosophical, I guess, arguably philosophical and contemplative understanding. So it kind of raises for me a very interesting question about knowledge itself. So in the sense that um, what counts as knowledge and how is knowledge acquired? So would you mind maybe speaking to that a little bit in terms of
Yeah.
talking about the difference between what we might call textual or intellectual knowledge and maybe what you describe as embodied or lived knowledge in
Mhm.
the tradition? Is that fair?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really appreciate that question, and you also saying that we could consider them as a philosophical tradition. As lovers of philosophy, and particularly philosophies coming from mystical and contemplative traditions, I appreciate that connection. So, I think we sort of live in a time where the nature of knowledge is confused, even in academia. And just the other day, I was listening to somebody talk about AI models being based on all of human knowledge, squillions of words and all of human knowledge that has been produced. And I thought, well, that's an assumption that knowledge is entirely explicit and based on the written word.
Mm.
And it excludes prehistory, any pre-written history, right?
Yeah.
So that just shows that we sort of throw around this word knowledge, but we're not entirely sure what we mean in higher education nowadays. So, and I think we're facing, it's a good time for the question because, we live in this poly crisis where we're consciously destroying our own habitat. So something's not rational in what we're doing. And so when you look at the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, this nunnery that's the case study of my ethnography, it's a bit of an extreme example. Um, but you could look at Tibetan Buddhism anywhere and see it's a really interesting example of how any of the greatest scholars of Tibetan Buddhism, be it from the Gelugpa scholastic school like Tsongkhapa, or the Jamgon Kongtrul and the Jamyen Khyentse Wampos of the 20th century kind of contemplative era, uh, very much sort of celebrating the contemplative lineages era, that the greatest scholars often were deriving their knowledge from visions.
Mm.
And often, as much as they were writing largely in retreat and contemplative settings. And so the nunnery is a bit of an extreme example because the nuns, as you say, they're not scholars as we would mean it in most modern contexts. So they don't dialectically study their texts. But again, they do have their own corpus. They have their own 16 volumes, which are based on 25 volumes of a 17th century collection that were then adapted, or we could say redacted, for the time that the nunnery was founded into 16 volumes.
Right.
So they have their own set of texts, and they certainly have their own discourse around those texts. But these nuns, they don't train in any dialectical way. So if you ask the nuns questions, what does this word mean? And when I'm visualizing this practice, is it red or blue? And does the face, often the nuns are not trained, they're not trained to necessarily give theoretical and explanations. So they're not focused on that type of an answer. So sometimes the nuns would give me contradicting answers,
Mm-hmm.
despite the fact that they're like the experts in the region and that they're doing these practices all day long.
Yeah.
So the kind of way of knowing that they're prizing, and in fact, any tradition in their region, any practice lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, whether they're scholars or not, the highest kind of principle of knowing is, we could say, experiential.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to exclude texts and the intellect on the path of that understanding. So so the nunnery, they read all day long. The type of texts that they're reading are mostly liturgical and meditative instructions, like sadhana texts and then meditative instructions. So extremely profound meaning. But again, they don't study them dialectically. But you could look at another monastery where they do the same practices with the same types of texts and maybe do study as a component of their curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
but the goal of learning would be the same. And that goal of learning is, we can imagine the historical Gautama Buddha on the eve of his awakening, sitting down after years and years of exploration and learning and contemplative methods of knowing. And then we can sort of try to imagine that moment when he awakened, and then it says that the earth was his witness, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the earth
Yeah.
was the one true witness that understood.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like it was this idea that popped into his head. It wasn't any kind of explicit or abstract object of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It probably encompassed that, but it was something very whole person. And so when you look at the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, it's interesting because it's very much body based.
Mm-hmm.
And so while, of course, the intellect can be employed to, the Gelugpas will study for 25 years at minimum,
Mm-hmm.
of, these treaties. So it definitely will employ the intellect, but it's always understood that the whole body, that it's really an integration of mind and body, and that in Tantric Buddhism, literally, the body knows that all components of the mind-body interface, which is ontologically understood to be inseparable, mind and body, that all components of the mind-body complex are conscious and awakened. So you hear about the subtle body of prana, nadi, and bindu, which is really the whole context of somebody like this nunnery, or a lot of Tibetan Buddhism is employing, practicing, seeing the world through an understanding of mind-body integration. So the channels, the nadi channels, and the prana, we could call this subtle energy a little bit like chi, but the principle in Tantric Buddhism is that prana and consciousness or mental consciousness are like a horse and a rider.
Mhm.
So, whatever the habits of mental consciousness, the nadi, the channels, and the prana mirror that. But likewise, whatever the nadi and the prana are doing, likewise, the mental consciousness mirrors that. So the principle is to manipulate the prana and nadi, the subtle energies of the mind-body complex, the subtle body complex, to expedite that experience of non-conceptual awareness. So these nuns, for example, who are really experts in these practices, these yogic practices, from the first years of their training as young women, they start to practice like tumo, so kind of prana and nadi practices where they're manipulating the breath. They'll often be holding the breath and holding it kind of in the kind of lower chakra, sort of the sacral chakra, and manipulating the breathing, manipulating the breath. But of course, it's done with visualization. So they'll be visualizing their Guru Buddha, blessing them. But they'll also be visualizing oneself as a Buddha, perhaps as a feminine Buddha, but understanding that the nature of the so-called external Buddha and one's own mind is the same. And then there's a lot of devotion. So they're doing these breathing practices, energy practices with visualization, with really so much devotion. You could almost say the devotion is the fuel. And then they get the energies from the secondary channels and all of the subsidiary channels carefully balanced in the central channel. And when that happens in the correct way, and it's balanced at the heart, then naturally the experience is non-conceptual, primordial, what they would say is primordial unconditioned awareness, which is the goal, to recognize that, to awaken to what is always there, what is always the very basic nature of our consciousness. And that's sort of manipulated and brought about. Then they familiarize themselves through meditation with that.
It's raising a lot more questions for me than I had already had written down. So,
All right.
um, because there's a whole question of, I mean, what we're talking about is, in very broad terms, knowledge and transformation. Um, Knowledge and transformation, I should say, not in transformation, and because there's a question of what is knowledge and
Mm,
then what it does. And I think this tradition and Buddhism in general leans more into transformation than talking about ontology, like what is the nature of um what is the nature of the knowledge being discussed, correct, Uh,
mm,
so it's not really a question of but when I was listening to you, I also sort of got a sense of, I mean, there's incredible what we might say in another tradition, saying Judeo-Christian tradition, sort of metaphysics at play. So there's a metaphysic template and there's a metaphysic underlying framework, which is the devotional aspect which you were referring to, the sort of contemplation of the Buddha beyond and the Buddha within, and the sort of meeting of the two perhaps, which is quintessential because it's kind of part of the guidance. Otherwise, you're sort of going into the vastness of nothing
mm.
and easily lose your way. And I've read plenty of this sort of thing in my time studying Buddhism.
Mhm, that's right.
That, so
I
I
heard.
mean, I know a little bit about that. But I guess yeah, what's kind of striking for me is the location of this did you say primordial or primal?
Primordial. Mm,
Primordial knowledge that is, I guess, I don't know if the word is correct, inherent. It's kind
mhm,
of within,
mm,
at least I would rather use within
mhm.
because it's I, I mean, again, I sort of, I'm reticent about the words I'm using because none of these words are sufficient in a
Yeah,
sense saying it's within, but not just within me and you,
yeah.
but within everything, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And this manipulation that you're talking about is
Yeah.
precisely designed about getting it out or
Yeah.
activating it or realizing it and making it your whole body experience.
Yeah.
So this is kind of my next question is about body and knowledge.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
the role of the body, um, you know, given everything that you've said, so context, meditation, um, there's mental aspects, but it's
Mhm.
not, the
Yeah.
mentality of it is kind of not necessarily where it's located. It's in the body,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the mind is in the body too, but
Yeah.
it's not this kind of platonic, high intellectual, abstract thing.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
even that is kind of a understanding in some ways.
Yeah.
I'm sure Platonists would want to fight me back on this, but anyway, we'll leave that to the side. But you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
Do you want
I
to
mean,
speak a little bit more about the body? Yeah, the role
I
of the.
mean, and and even when it comes to the words and intellect, I mean, Buddhism is this tradition that's very comfortable with the written word and
Mm,
text. It's this heavily
yeah.
textual and heavily intellectual, can be a heavily intellectual tradition, despite what the Buddha might have said about that.
Mhm,
Because you can find these early suttas, the Atthakavagga suttas, for example, where the Buddha is quite critical of the intellectual pursuit of truth,
mhm,
or at least a solely intellectual pursuit of truth, right?
mhm.
But Buddhism as a tradition is very comfortable with the intellect and very comfortable with words. And I think that's because they understand that it's not the thing in itself.
Yeah,
They're not struggling to reconcile that,
yeah.
question of what is true knowledge. Like they know that it's something much more whole. And so I would say in many cases, some of the great Buddhist masters have used their intellect to its greatest potential. There's no kind of muting of the intellect, but rather it's in its place.
Right.
It's known that it will be exhausted in that complete knowledge. So for a Buddhist, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, based on Buddha nature, the notion of the Tathagata Garbha and the Buddha nature treaties, and certainly this nunnery is very much a living tradition based almost entirely on that as a philosophy.
Wow.
So it's pretty simple. So these nuns, again, they're not scholars, but any neighboring scholastic monastery, it would be the same for them too. So the 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 entire philosophy can be boiled down into a simple teaching, and they're reminded of it again and again and again, that the nature of our consciousness, which isn't separate from the body, as far as we're a person,
Mm,
it's the nature of a whole being. Um, it's empty. If you look for your mind, you can't find it anywhere. And these traditions, they practice this. So the first thing that a monk or a nun or a lay practitioner would do when they've met a great master, often they have to go away for a few weeks and to try and find their mind. And then you have to go back to the master one by one and tell the master, demonstrate, because it's very much a practical tacit tradition. So you're not giving answers, you're demonstrating your experience, trying to explain your experience, what you found. And you can't copy what somebody else said or you'll get badly scolded. And at the end of it, you realize you can't find it. You can't find a location, you can't find a shape, a form, a color. You can't find any substantial quality of mind, but nevertheless, it knows, it's clear and knowing. So the definition of Buddha nature, the definition of mind, according to the Tantric Buddhist tradition, would be it's empty, you can't find anything, yet it's cognizant,
mm,
it's knowing. And sometimes there's a third aspect to that it's unimpeded experience, which I think maps a little bit interesting onto Satchitananda in the Vedanta traditions, but in the Buddhist one, it's not nothing because,
mm.
and there's a beautiful prayer, the Mahamudra aspiration prayer, where it says it's not nothing because everything has arisen from it, samsara and nirvana, but it's not anything because even the Buddhas have never found it. So it's this paradox, right?
I love it. It takes
Yeah.
me right back. Um, I guess it's fair. I get for I personally, I'm enjoying this immensely, and I want to get more into, but it might be helpful to those tuning in as well. To speak a little bit about non-duality,
Mhm.
if you don't mind. So devotion and non-duality, but also in the sense that we've been talking about. So we're, locating the mind, etc. So there's this non-dual aspect as part of this paradox that you were just referring to, I think. Do you would you like to maybe expand a little bit on maybe like a very introductory, elementary explanation of what is non-duality?
Oh,
And then
don't
we can
worry.
get into a
Gosh,
little bit more nuance.
that's a tough question,
Yeah,
Milad.
I know, right? It's like, can you explain this simply, please? It's Buddhism. There's nothing simple.
Right. I mean, I'll just stick with the tradition. Of course,
Yeah,
there are various philosophical schools in Buddhism, and they won't
yeah.
necessarily define it in the same way. But if I stick to the Mahayana philosophy that this nunnery, this Tibetan Buddhist nunnery, is based on,
Mm,
it would be the non-duality of inherently existing subject and object.
mm,
And in fact, any Buddhist epistemology, any Buddhist sort of, pramana, the whole school of valid cognition
yeah.
would understand that the knowing mind and what it knows are not, you could even say, are not ontologically dual. So everything in some way is an image of itself. But of course, non-duality, it's not the opposite of dualism either, is it?
Mm,
And
right.
so, when you look at a world, and I think the interesting part of looking at a whole world of a living tradition that's, one of these rare examples of a tradition that's actually living in a very pre-modern way, is that non-duality, it's again, it's not this abstract idea. It's not some kind of transcendent abstract, realm of an idea. It's literally in the body. So this knowledge that, and it, that the landscape is alive.
Mm,
And the subtle body, I might actually, if you don't mind, just bring up a slide
yeah, please
of a
do.
scroll that just helps to show this. So
Mm,
this is sort of an ancient Tantric Buddhist scroll. And so these practitioners of Tantric Buddhism, again, there's a lot of visualization of the body, there's a lot of energy work, and there's a lot of devotion. And the whole point is to realize that non-conceptual nature of primordial awareness. And they say primordial because it is that way now, even as we speak. We're never separated from it. Um, and so it's never been born and it never dies, they'll say. And that's what they're aiming to awaken to. And they're not trying to create something new. They're not trying to fabricate or construct a meditation state or create some kind of new, better consciousness. They'll say it's the same for Buddhas and it's the same for non-Buddhas. It's the basic nature of awareness. And so non-duality is just really awakening to this in a way that's completely unconditioned by a conceptual habit.
mm,
And it doesn't mean that they don't, that an awakened being then doesn't have concepts and use the intellect. Of course, they probably use it better than before, but they're not attached to that as the thing in itself.
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, as a definition, the non-duality of subject and object, but really that involves the body, it involves the environment, involves our complete and profound, infinite interconnectedness with all that we experience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so I have to say, it's the more I think about this, and you can appreciate this is something that's been with me for a long time now. And I'm incredibly partial to the Buddhist tradition, generally speaking, Buddhist epistemology in particular. But the so this is incredibly sophisticated as far as I mean, I want to compliment it, but at the same time, I'm kind of drawn to this question of devotion because it's paired with devotion. It's
Mm,
not just say, a natural realization where the person then is like, well, this is the reality in the sense of um, not born, not dying. It just is.
mhm,
So these are just perceptions of our sense of what is true. Something is born, something dies. Um, But I wonder to what extent you might say that is devotional speak versus realization speak. So I think there's a tension in Buddhism
Mm,
always present in my perception of it, in my
mhm,
reading of it, that there is this kind of devotion speak and insight speak, and they're often paired really brilliantly, but I can't help but see that tension.
mhm,
Um, and because I guess if I walk it back, what I mean is because then, you have insight that leads to certain realizations, but that insight then is immediately captured by devotional epistemology
mhm.
or metaphysics or understanding, conceptualization. And then that insight then is kind of drawn into a world of interpretation again,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
world of hermeneutics again, where it lives and it still shines beautifully. And if you can see it, you see it. But at the same time, it's trapped in that trapped, but contained in that understanding, that devotional sense of understanding,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
Sorry,
Yeah. I
that's a
mean,
bit.
I think I understand what you're saying. And, the Buddhists themselves, they have these internal conflicts as
Uh-huh.
well with this tension. And sometimes it's the tension between the scholar and the yogin, or kind of the faith and the experience, and then the hermeneutic, or the explanation. Um,
Yeah.
um, and so, yeah, certainly different Buddhist traditions might have that between traditions, but even within a single lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, you find that tension.
Mm.
And people, generation after generation are trying to reconcile it. And of course, we do that in the realm of explicit knowledge for the purposes of trying to communicate, what is truth. There's a very beautiful text. I think it's called the Madhyamaka Alamkara. And it's a very popular text among the practice lineages, the scholars of practice lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And so it's Shantarakshita, I think. So I can't recall exactly. I think maybe 10th century, originally Sanskrit composed text. So what it does is it's saying, okay, so when we're trying to explicate, when we're working within the realm of hermeneutics and trying to interpret and understand what is truth, in Mahayana Buddhism, the Madhyamaka, that deconstruction,
Yep.
it's not form is, that's not your eyes, your ears, that whole heart sutra
Yeah.
idea that you try and find it, you will never find any inherently independently existing phenomena, knower, truth, Buddha, sentient being anywhere. It's a
Mm.
complete deconstruction, it's a negation.
Mm.
So when we're working it out hermeneutically, this text would say this is the right interpretive approach because it sees clearly. But then when you sit down and you practice yoga and meditation, there is something,
Mm.
and there's every now and then in a Buddha nature treatise you hear the word self with a capital S. I mean, it's Buddhist, so they're extremely cautious to not reify it. It doesn't truly exist. But of course, there's a Buddha that awakens, or there's a mystic that knows God, or you know,
Mm.
so that experience is not a nothing, right? So then they'll say that when it comes to the practice, that Yogacara, the mind-only philosophy of Buddhism, is the appropriate one. So that when we're hermeneutically trying to figure it out with our intellect, the Madhyamaka, that deconstruction, the nothingness, that's the best interpretive approach. But when it comes to sitting down and really applying this in our yogic experience, the Yogacara philosophy, where that non-dualism is the non-duality of subject and object, and we truly understand how the mind, in fact, does create our reality. That's really where liberation happens. And so, we can never find a perfect philosophy,
Mm.
and it depends on why we're doing it. And so I kind of like the text myself because it's
Yeah.
comfortable with the contradiction. It can say, okay, you can have this philosophy for that and this philosophy for that. It depends what you're doing it for.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very beautiful thing about Buddhism is that it's comfortable with the contradictions. And in fact, it has a great deal of nuance and complexity within its traditions, textual and contemplative. Um, so I guess this kind of question of devotion is
Mm,
in a way coming from, the focus of religious studies, studying religion. We're ultimately studying a religion. We're ultimately looking, observing a religious form of life, and and I know that is in itself complicated, and that is a categorical, you know, me trying to be, categorically definitive about something, which is problematic in itself. I understand that, but at the same time, when we're talking about these practices, there is an incredible devotional aspect to it, which is
Mm,
paired with an incredible insight about reality, the reality of oneself and the whole of existence, um, or non-existence, as the
mm.
case may be.
Right. Yeah. You know,
And it's like, wow. So that pairing, I guess my question is how do they manage it? And I think what you've answered is that they just manage it, and they
mm.
manage it well. They've been Who am I to question this, Elizabeth? Just say me, lad. Move on.
But
You
I,
cannot
the
question this.
question is something in the question though. I mean, the question needs to be resolved, and I don't think it will stop until it is, you know.
Mm,
Have you come across Studstill? I think it's Randall Studstill. He wrote a book maybe in the 80s or 90s or perhaps even later, actually. I think it's called The Unity of Mystical Traditions. And he's looking at particularly at Tibetan mysticism and German mysticism.
wow.
And I didn't read the whole book, but when I was trying to figure out this question of devotion for myself, or at least how I would explain it, I found him the most helpful.
Mhm.
And he's saying, in any mystical tradition, particularly like the one we're looking at, where you're very deliberately employing yoga and meditation and technologies of consciousness to disrupt the habitual structures of what we think is the self and the world, this so-called real world that we've been living in and identified with. And then through these practices, that all starts to fall apart, and it leads to a profound unknowing, right? Profound cognitive dissonance. And in fact, the Tibetans will often say that any real practitioner will encounter a period in their practice when it's very destabilizing.
Yeah.
And in some rare cases, you do see, mentally very imbalanced, you know, people in Tibet that have arrived at that through their practice. And Studd still says that faith is therefore so important because when a practitioner in a religion is deliberately employing contemplative techniques to go to the great unknown, and the unknown is something we don't know, it's profoundly unsettling. But faith is it's almost its own way of knowing, and it's maybe come from the examples of great masters that we've seen or the inspiring teachings that we've read and heard and been convinced of. And then when we get to that point, that faith, which is just, almost a feeling in the heart, but when that faith is there in the practitioner, it's almost like a ship that carries them across. And Studd still calls on systems theory, and he'll say that, if something's collapsing, like that habitual structure is collapsing, just like a system is collapsing, it has two ways it can go. It can contract into like a spiritual crisis,
Mm,
or it can expand into a greater self-awareness. And so faith in this kind of a context really functions to
mm,
carry the practitioner to the unknown when
mm,
you don't know what it is, and it's really scary because you don't know what it is.
mhm, mhm.
So,
Th- This is exactly, and this is where I think the crux of the matter lies, and I guess the heart of the question that I'm sort of pushing at, because I'm familiar with German mysticism. I'm familiar with the Buddhist practices here to a certain extent, and I mean, that when I sift through the literature and I'm reading these texts, um, like for me, there's sometimes there is a degree of posturing. So there's this kind of like devotional posturing. So I've had a crisis, but this has been resolved because of the light and guidance of the Buddha or the light and guidance of Christ, whatever the case may be. And then I'm brought back to the center, I'm brought back to peace and contentment, and I see the way, etc. I'm just paraphrasing, just using wild language. But essentially, the problematics of this, and this is kind of the question of that pairing of devotionality, devotion, and insight. So devotion speak, insight speak. So these transformative experiences, the kinds that mystics encounter, through their practices. So if you're a German mystic of the time, you kind of doing certain practices, contemplative practices also. I mean, there's immense overlap here in terms of what they're doing, which is fascinating. But, that leads you to a certain insight or realization, which is disruptive, turns everything on its head. It creates commotion and chaos inside you, panic, anxiety, awe, fear, etc. But at the same time, something calms you, and that is the faith element, I guess, Start Still was talking about. Um, but there's a nagging question for me, right?
Mhm.
Right. Um, and you know me well enough to know what's bothering me here. And I don't know if it can ever be resolved, but I think there's a kind of point where whoever it is goes, all right, look, it's enough of that wildness, and I'm just going to settle into my epistemology and my tradition. I'm going to let Christ guide me. I'm going to let the Buddha guide me. But you see, here's my thing. Like, if you get a tantric Buddhist who realizes the immense realization that they do, and it transforms them in their body and mind, and in the way that they exist and are present into the world, why don't they become Christian? Why don't they see Christ? Why
Uh-huh.
don't they, I don't
Mm.
know, become a whirling dervish?
Right.
Yeah, so,
I think they
and
have their equivalents though of the whirling dervishes. They're
on it,
not, where they, yeah, that
I'm being
incredible joy
facetious
and
here a little
yeah,
bit, but
yeah.
I'm just kind of, but before we leave this, I just want to just close the loop on this. The question that I'm asking is that
Mm.
they they don't go and become something else in terms of epistemology, theology. They remain in their Buddhist tradition, in a way grounded in their Buddhist tradition. So it's a question of where is the ground of their understanding? Is it the
Hmm.
insight that transforms them, the
Hmm.
so-called whole body knowledge experience, or is it the devotion that grounds them and locates them, contextualizes them, gives them that sense of being in the world?
Blessed or something.
Yeah.
I think this
Sorry.
may come back to the question of non-duality because of course, the kind of early Buddhism, the Pali Buddhism and the Theravadan school would understand the Buddha as the historical
Yeah.
Gautama, right?
Yeah.
That other than that, some
Mhm.
cosmic, then the Mahayana iconography, it almost seems like they're these cosmic deities that abide in heavens. And, the early Buddhist interpretation would, based on the Pali Canon, would poo-poo that, It's a misunderstanding. But the Mahayana and the Vajrayana traditions philosophically don't understand them to be externally existing deities. They're still non-theistic
Mhm.
philosophies. Of course, any
Yeah.
form
Yeah.
of Buddhism is non-theistic, and so Tibetan Buddhism is an incredibly creative. There's so much creative visualization, and I think the landscape, the Tibetan plateau at that altitude, plus you don't have a lot of oxygen in your brain, and who knows what leads to it, but it's this incredibly colorful, detailed, rich visual tradition, but it's functioning non-dually. It's functioning towards a non-dual realization. So when a Tibetan Buddhist, any Tantric Buddhist sits down and does their practice, almost every time that practice will be a kind of sadhana where
Mm.
they visualize them maybe external, but most often themselves as a Buddha.
Mm.
So understanding that from emptiness, just like, we're not who we think we are.
Mhm.
We label ourselves and we're so attached to our identities and our body as the self, but even that's not really the way it is. And so in the same way, from this kind of pure potential, they generate themselves, they visualize themselves as the Buddha. It might be, say, Amitabha or a Buddha of their choice.
Yeah.
And then the energy of that Buddha and the presence of that Buddha. So they call on the Buddha as if it's coming from external,
Yeah.
as it's the real Buddha, because it's hard to think that you're a Buddha, right? So they call on that, invoke that truly existing Buddha
Yeah.
into their ordinary consciousness and understand that the nature of the Buddha and one's own mind is the same.
Mm.
And then visualize themselves and they do the mantra. And then at the end, they dissolve the visualization into nothingness. And so, although it seems like there's an external Buddha, it's just a symbol. And it's a symbol not as an external representation, but almost like an emanation of itself. So it's not really external. It's just a creative, symbolic function that helps the practitioner to recognize their Buddha nature, which again is empty of any color, shape, feature that could ever be substantially found, or but nevertheless is aware and experiences everything that the mind experiences. Um, and so it has this sort of non-dual function. And then the Tibetans are particularly devotional.
Mm.
Again, it might be their landscape and certain reasons of culture, but you don't find that intense outward-looking devotion in the other Buddhist schools, particularly the Pali Buddhist schools. You wouldn't necessarily see that, but the explanation, of course, is the devotion. It's not in anything outside of yourself, that it's it's your own nature of mind. And I'm just going to share a quick slide here because there's some quotations from the text that form the corpus of this tradition. And this is, kind of similar to most monasteries in Tibet.
Mm.
So these are the types of instructions that would be the essence of the practice, what they're doing.
Right.
So although they visualize a lot and there's a lot of conceptual devotional activity and outward imagery, the hermeneutic at all times is it's your mind as it is right now without constructing a meditation state. That's the Buddha and nowhere else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the devotion is almost in your own pure potential,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which our modern world, sadly, I think has, our education systems, I think of any time in history, we've really lost the inspiration of our potential as humans.
Mm-hmm. There is a, you're absolutely right in terms of our potential um, being, I guess, sidelined to a degree. Um, but there's this thing here about, and we're going to turn to the question in a moment about um, the methodology. But I think, and this is related, so it's kind of segue. Um, in those words that I was reading, to me, they're kind of like they're not even themselves the point. The point is to get you to. It's almost like how do you see what you cannot see is to stop seeing what you can see. It's kind of like you kind of have to distract yourself in a certain way so then something else can appear that you are blocking.
Hmm.
The only thing that comes to mind right now, and this is a dumb example, is like when I look at the sun accidentally and I'm blinded
Hmm.
and I'm looking ahead and I see the shadow of the sun in my eye, but the only way I can see ahead is if I look to the side and I can see what's ahead in my peripheral. Does that make sense? I don't
Hmm.
know if anyone's had this
Yeah,
experience.
yeah, yeah,
But it's
yeah.
the only way, so it's how I walk and not fall over. So it's kind of like by distraction to
Hmm.
get to the truth because you're always constantly getting in your own way. And this is
Hmm.
the kind of point of mysticism, I think, generally, but Buddhism has definitely got the finger on the pulse there, which is
Mm,
why I love that tradition so much.
mm,
And even though there's loads and loads of devotional speak and epistemology at the same time, they don't quite ultimately allow that to get in the way of the insight and the
mhm,
experience and the
mm,
transformation, which again
mm,
is why it's so appealing to me over and over again.
mm,
I can't get enough of it. So orality, literacy, and how learning happens. This is a methodological point in your book, which is supremely important. And I want to invite you to please speak to us a little bit about this. So how does this actually happen
mm,
in this community? For example, I'm just throwing some questions out there, but you can sort of direct us however you want. What is the relationship between oral transmission, textual learning, contemplative practice, and what does it mean? And I'm going to emphasize this to learn
right.
in the world, not anywhere else,
Yeah,
in
right. Yeah.
right here and now. What does it mean to learn, Elizabeth?
Mm, mm. On that note, I'm going to pull up some slides to help me out here again.
Awesome.
I found kind of from the vantage point of distance, because this ethnography that I'm speaking from was based on my participant observation going back, finishing 8 years ago. So between
Wow.
2006 and 2018, I spent a lot of time in and around this nunnery, just observing and sometimes participating as a visitor. And now, here I am 7, 8 years later. I'm working in higher education, mostly teaching. I think a lot about pedagogy. I think about the problems of the world and the responsibility of education. And I'm finding a really helpful analytical lens on the nunnery. And the question you just asked is about tacit knowledge, explicit and tacit knowledge. And this Michael Polanyi, who I think is,
Mm.
interestingly, we just don't hear enough about him. And he was in sustained conversation with Einstein. He was this, Hungarian-born Jew, so had to leave Hungary,
Mm.
got out of Germany just in time. It ended up in England, but he started out as a chemist, and his son was a Nobel Prize winner.
Wow.
Several of the students, he made great discoveries, was in conversation with Einstein, so very much a scientist.
Mhm.
But then there was this period of socialized science, where the state would determine what research was done and what discoveries would be made. And as a pushback against that, he focused in his career more on what we might call philosophy of science, but really about epistemology and this whole tacit. He wrote a book called The Tacit Dimension. So
Right.
his thesis would be that all knowledge is either tacit or rooted in tacit knowledge. A wholly explicit knowledge is unthinkable. And I find this really, really helpful for the questions that we're asking. That there's no problem with the intellect, there's no problem with the knowledge. The problem happens when we lose sight of that whole iceberg.
Mm.
Or I think you could make a parallel with the whole mystic body,
Mhm.
body of any mystic.
Yeah.
There's the words, there's the expression, there's the ways we think about it and explicate it.
Mm.
But that's never separate from the holistic knowledge, which we might call the tacit knowledge,
Mm.
which is coming from the whole mind-body interface. And when we live in a time when certainly the classroom involves, we recognize it involves tacit knowledge at every turn, but credentials are almost entirely literate credentials, word count, degrees, what you can write, the output, explicit output, that it's almost like this active erasure of
Mm.
tacit knowledge in the times that we live in. So a tradition like Buddhism is very much a tacit tradition. So if you look in the Atthakavagga, some of these earliest Pali Suttas,
Mm.
you can see the Buddha saying, non-attachment to views, that a real Buddhist practitioner, a real Brahmin mendicant, has no dogma. They don't hold on to a particular philosophical viewpoint.
Mhm.
The view is the view that is beyond any viewpoint, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, by its own definition, the Mahayana, the perfection of wisdom, is beyond thought, beyond description.
Mm.
It can be known or experienced as the wisdom of our own awareness.
Yeah.
And then we go on to the Chan and the Zen traditions, or at times, very reticent even with the written word. You come across Zen masters like Basui, who would write letters to students who were sick and couldn't visit him, but say, burn the letter when you're done, because this isn't it. This letter is not it, and I'm very reluctant to even write this out.
Mm.
You have to look, who is the knower?
Mm.
Who is the person who hears? Who is the mind that knows? So it's that very direct looking at the awareness. So Buddhism is fundamentally, I'd say, aiming toward a tacit kind of holistic knowledge. So when we look at the nunnery, it's a tradition that's aimed toward that kind of ultimately tacit knowledge, but they read probably 5 to 7 hours a day. They
Wow.
spend more than half their year in sadhana, collective ritual ceremonies where they're chanting all day long. And again, they have these huge texts, 16 volumes of texts, and many other volumes that they're reading from. So a nun will join usually when she's maybe in her young teens. She might have an older sister or aunt that's in the nunnery already,
Yeah.
and she'll join. And they do not have like phonics classes. They don't have classes that teach them how to read or teach them the meaning of the text. Instead, they just like jump right in. So
Mhm.
here she would start by looking after the yak herd for 2 years
Mm.
and learning from the older nuns how to sound out the words. And many of the words in the text are vernacular, so she would know what they mean, but because it's Tantric Buddhism, it's incredibly profound and quite cryptic at times. It's a lot of symbolic language. So she certainly won't understand most of it, but
Mm.
she knows how to read it. She knows how to pronounce it and read it and join in the chanting. And when she gets the chance to join in the ritual ceremonies, It's really fun for her because they're playing the instruments, they get to wear the costumes, they get food and drink throughout the day, and there's music, and it's theatrical. And they dive in and they start reading these texts over and over and over again, year after year, so that eventually they memorize them by repetition. And because the nature of the text are sadhana and about recognizing their own Buddha nature as an embodied person, it's almost like the words, there's a lot of instruction, sort of
Yeah.
a symbolic description, but also instruction coming through. So it's almost like they're internalizing those words and then they memorize them over time. But again, if you ask the nun to explain things, usually they'll say, ask another nun who knows better. And the other nun who knows best will say, it's like this. But don't worry about the details. Don't worry about the details. That's not the most important thing. It's about knowing the presence, that divine presence of the nature of your mind, of the Buddha nature, will mostly be the answer that they give. Um, so they learn to read quite instinctively,
Wow.
and they are doing hours and hours of this chanting. And they start in the winter. They'll start at 4:30 in the morning. The winters they're really intensive practice season because there are no distractions and the atmosphere is very clear.
Mm.
They do more meditation in the winter. So they'll start at 4:30 in the morning. They'll finish at around 8 p.m. When they stop to go to the loo, it's 2.5 minutes. I timed it. They come right back in and they have a maybe hour lunch break. They have endless enthusiasm for the chanting.
Mm.
And so for me, I learned to read books in Canada and, in my higher graduate studies in Australia. And the way I'm conditioned to read is a world apart from the ways that they're reading and the ways that they make meaning from the text. So I felt really concerned that I was trying to keep up with the reading, but I felt I needed to understand what I was reading, up here. I needed to understand to be doing the practice right. Meanwhile, I had these like 11-year-old nuns just breezing through it next to me. Um, and then also I would become quite bored because they were repeating a lot of the same types of prayers and practices over and over and over. And you'd get to the end of the formal practice and they'd be doing then 2 hours of dedication prayers. And a couple of times I would break. I would be so bored that I'd have to leave. But I think what happens for them, because it's a tacit form of knowledge, just like training in dance or sports or doing something over and over and over again, it kind of feels boring. But every time we do it, it's actually different. And finally something shifts or clicks or sinks in, and it's this tacit form of
Mm.
embodied knowledge. But what's interesting about Buddhist tacit knowledge, if we're looking at like dance or riding a bike, you have these, instructions, this explicit instruction about what to do and how to do something. And you hear that over and over again from your teacher or your coach, and you put that into practice. And then as you're riding your bike as a master, once you've mastered the skill, you're not consciously thinking of the explicit knowledge. It's almost semi or subconscious.
Mm.
Whereas Buddhism, the perfection of wisdom, that self-awareness, it is both tacit but completely self-conscious.
Mhm.
So it's this very, unusual kind of tacit knowledge in the examples that are usually given. This is just a passage from one of the scriptures,
Mm.
sort of typical what they're visualizing.
It's incredible.
It's pretty complex, and
Mm.
for a modern urban dweller, it's a lot to fit in the mind. But in the spacious Tibetan plateau where they would herd, yak, and farm, they had room for that. It actually helped them.
Mm.
So it's a quite a complicated tradition.
That's beautiful.
And um,
Mm.
but when it comes to oral instruction, so that the texts themselves know this, and of course the tradition, the nuns know this, that the texts are an explicit form of transmission,
Mm.
but they are not the whole thing. And the texts are written in ways, sometimes there's an order that only by doing it you know where to jump ahead in the text.
Mm.
And and the real pith understanding is coming through in those oral instructions. So you have at times formal transmissions where a great master lama might visit the nunnery or the nuns might visit them. There might be hundreds of people that are formally receiving what's often called a pointing out instruction. So the Lama is pointing out the Buddha nature of your mind. You
Mm.
know, don't look in the past thought, don't anticipate the future thought, don't get caught up in what's appearing in your mind, just
Mm.
don't do anything, but don't be distracted. So there might be formal settings where that happens, but then off, I would say maybe most often,
Yeah.
the pith, like the deepest learning happens in these very informal exchanges, kind of spontaneous experience. So this
Mm.
picture on the left, you can see kind of on the right, there's a dreadlock yogin.
Yeah.
This is before mobile phones, so he was in a cave setting a few kilometers away from the nunnery, and he just turned up on horseback one day, and a few nuns knew he was coming, but most didn't. So suddenly they brought out the carpets, and they were there all day long in a picnic kind of a setting. They love picnics. And this yogin, who was considered their guru,
Mm.
was telling stories, probably life stories of masters during the Cultural Revolution and whatnot. And at times they were all crying, and at times they were all laughing, and at times there was profound moments of silence. And what's coming through again is this very simple
Mm.
pointing out what is the ultimate truth, that Buddha nature. And then on the right, this was one of the nuns that went up to the cave setting to visit one of the gurus, very revered guru, who'd actually managed to stay in his contemplative practice in a cave throughout the Cultural Revolution. So his dreadlocks had never been cut. Very unusual case. Mostly they'd had to be put in communes. And
Mm.
so this nun went up to him and with great devotion sat on her knees and just sang a song of, please may I recognize this Buddha nature of mind. And then they just sat like that for like 10 to 15 minutes, maybe, without saying anything.
Wow.
So, in it, the real pith, the real ultimate nature of what they're learning is not explicit, it's tacit, but
Mm.
it's a very rich, explicit tradition of texts and communication and ritual practices.
Mm.
And I think we find that probably in many religions, where it's aiming towards some kind of a whole person understanding.
I guess that's fair to say. But I think, as you say, it's not as explicit as it is in the Buddhist tradition, and in particular the one that you've studied. Um, there certainly seems to be indeed in the instructions, in the instruction manual to those
Mm,
reading. Whereas the other traditions, they kind of formulate a mystical tradition that informs people via complex language and other practices that you know yeah think differently.
mm,
It's not what you think it is.
right.
So I think Buddhism does something beautiful in that sense as a tradition as a whole, and then specific examples like this um, demonstrate that that's in fact true about Buddhism. I want to ask you a question about women practice and authority. So talking about nuns, obviously may come as a surprise to many, may not. To most who are aware, yes, there are nuns in Buddhism, and yes, women can become Buddhist masters and enlightened individuals, etc. Um, so this um, is women-centered contemplative community, and significant historically, socially. So the nuns had a distinctive way of approaching practice, authority, knowledge, transmission, I'm assuming. And to what extent would you say did this, if at all, differ from what we might encounter in more male-dominated settings?
Hmm. Yes, this particular nunnery was fairly unusual. So usually, you'd had nunneries from the origins of Buddhism in Tibet, going back to the 8th or however many centuries ago, 8th century, I suppose.
Yes.
You probably would have had nunneries fairly soon on, but almost always a nunnery would be like an annex of a monastery in
Yeah.
Tibet. And a monastery were often major centers and often political centers. So in many kingdoms, the kingdoms were organized according to sort of monastic prefectures that would be landholders and so on. So the nunneries would be annexes of that and almost always denied the highest yoga tantra practices. So they'd be employed to be doing a lot of prayers and more kind of exoteric sutric practices of purification of the Buddha of compassion, and often had a very, intimate relationship with the lay community, with the villages and their families, as informal counselors and as formal, caregiving in the home and that sort of thing. But when this nunnery was founded in 1892 in if we're looking at a map, it would be kind of the eastern Qinghai Tibetan Plateau in
Mhm.
present-day Qinghai province.
Mhm.
And in the late 19th century, there were pretty much no nunneries to speak of, and you can cross-reference this in other writings, that if you had nuns, they might be from an aristocratic family, where maybe an uncle was a lama and they learned to read and do some practice individually.
Mhm.
But nunneries kind of didn't exist, and if they did, they were very small. And this was a period called the Rime period, which means the non-sectarian period. It lasted a few hundred years in this region, and it was very much one that celebrated and tried to centralize the practice lineages and tried to also increase scholastic study and the written word to almost sort of defend themselves politically against stronger scholastic schools. But eclecticism was very much the name of the game. And so there were a couple of lamas. These would have been great yogins with long dreadlocks. This was very much the culture of the time. The yogin was the hero. In the late 19th century, any great lama probably had long dreadlocks and wore old robes and meditated for years in a cave and was quite ascetic. And a couple of these male lamas could say, okay, it's true. All the teachings tell us, all the Buddhist teachings tell us that Buddha nature is in all, whether you're higher class or lower class, whether you're male, female, regardless. But where are the nunneries? Women don't have the opportunity to, to cultivate this. So they very deliberately founded this nunnery. And so the nunnery was founded, and there were a lot of men around as well, but naturally a lot of women came, and women came from many different backgrounds, different lineages, family, different schools of Buddhism their families were coming from, and they all joined and very quickly and were given the highest tantric practices.
Mhm.
And within a generation, they had established themselves as sort of supreme in the region for the quality of their Vajrayana practice. And there's a chapter in the book called Blazing Splendor, which is a kind of memoirs of one of the lamas of the time. And he describes visiting the nunnery probably in the 1940s. And there would just be first of all, there was a very profound silence. It's a very silent atmosphere at the nunnery, which is still there. When you go, it's about 4,500 meters above tree line, very inclement weather, not a comfortable place materially, but there's quite a very profound atmosphere, and you'd see a sea of robes, he says, and there were 700 nuns by the 1940s. And unlike any nunneries in the past, they were called upon by the kings to do longevity rituals for the king. And that was almost unheard of, that women would be asked to do that. And these nuns became, kind of experts in the yogas and meditation, and in many cases were seen as teachers in their own right. And so the nunnery became quite autonomous, and they live in a very remote region, so their daily religious life is, we can say, entirely autonomous.
Mhm.
They don't have external male lamas or authorities that's disciplining them or requiring them to do certain things. They maintain that entirely on their own. Um, but what's interesting is in Tibetan Buddhism, in Tantric Tibetan Buddhism, there are three lines of transmission. There's so there's the empowerment ritual. So if you're going to do a sadhana practice to visualize yourself as Amitabha, for example, the practitioner first needs an empowerment. So that's a ritual transmission that's done on the basis of texts. And the person giving that needs to have received it from a living lineage. So that's on the basis of texts. So empowerments, and then there's the oral transmission of text, where if you're going to study a Buddhist text, you just have it read to you by a lama so that it's like an oral tradition of the text. But that also requires the book. And then the third one is called Trika, which is meditation instruction. So you have empowerment, textual transmission, and meditation instruction. And in all cases, even at this nunnery, only males will give the text-based transmission. So any written lines of transmission are still very much held by the male authorities.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the meditation instruction, which can be based on text and often is, but can also be oral, entirely oral, coming from experience to experience. In that case, you see the nuns will
Mhm.
do that. They're not necessarily recognized formally for it, but very much depend on each other for that. So when the nuns are learning their practices, be it the highest yogas or the Dzogchen meditation, the highest forms of meditation, they're largely learning from each other, from the senior nuns, those older generations. But when it comes to written lines of transmission, the men do it all. And in the last 10 years, there have there have been some texts written about the history of the nunnery. So the nunnery was founded again in 1892, but went on to have about 40 branches around the Tibetan Plateau. Most of those were nunneries, three of them were monasteries. So this is, I think, the first case in Tibetan history that had a branch monastery of a nunnery.
Wow.
But the history books written about all of this don't mention any of the nuns.
Mm.
And in oral, there's a lot of storytelling because it's not that old of a tradition. The nuns today remember the nuns from before, and they know them by name, and they know exactly what they did and what the lineage depends on them for.
Yeah.
But in the written record, it's not there.
Wow.
So yeah, there's still very much a gendered tradition of literacy, and so that's here. But what you see happening since the 1980s is this extremely rapid modernization of the Tibetan Plateau, of
Yeah.
Western China.
Yeah.
So whereas Europe went through the printing press and the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Information and the digital age and AI in many hundreds of years,
Mm.
the Tibetans in China have gone through this in like 40, 50 years.
Mm.
So when you look at the religious tradition adapting, like most religions adapting and modernization, there was a period where it was extreme push to accredited scholarship. So any new nunneries today, and there are more and more nunneries because democracy and equality of gender is something very important. It's a important value today in modern China. So you have a lot of nunneries today, and they're studying the same curriculum as the monks were studying. So monks that used to become accredited scholars in Tibetan Buddhism, you have many nuns getting those degrees as well now.
Okay.
Um, but I think this is still the only case where you see this nunnery is the only case where you see a group of women that are um, as well trained in the yogas and meditation and recognized for their expertise in the practices. And even some of the biggest monastic centers are taking those yogic instructions from the nuns of this nunnery because they're full-time practitioners and they've really held on to their pre-modern curriculum despite a lot of peer pressure to bring in more scholarship. They've said no, our way is direct
Mhm.
experience. But it's a shame. I would love to see them learning to write
Mm.
more fluently because if they can write their histories,
Yeah.
it will serve them well. Uh, this generation, I think it's too late for them, but they can audio record their stories and maybe have them transcribed. So there's still a lot of double standards.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my kind of concluding question was around this very thing that you just touched on, modernity and the future of contemplative traditions, in the sense that, would such a tradition, it is such a tradition at risk of disappearing? But I think you're sort of making me feel a little bit more reassured that they will most likely survive, I hope,
Mm.
if I understood you correctly. Um,
One hopes for sure. I think the greater threat to the tradition, I mean, I think the will of the community itself is to continue,
mm,
and even of the lay people and the surrounding environment. I think the local environment, anyhow, the will is to continue. There are numerous challenges
yeah,
that I won't get into here, but
yeah, yeah.
very significant challenges, but the will is there. But I think truly, I think the biggest challenge is our modern ways of knowing,
Mm,
and that in mainstream institutional education, especially in modern China now, it's so much about explicit. It's so much based on the transmission of information and explicit understanding, um, that we've sort of lost sight of the to and from between the tacit and the explicit. So when I look at Tibetan Buddhism in the West, it's really taking root. There's a lot of hundreds, if not thousands, of people now that have done 3-year retreats and are really dedicating themselves, and sacrificing a lot of economic security to be living in contemplation. And
right.
but I think the kind of greater atmosphere and with AI, it's almost like unless we get offline for long periods,
Mm,
it's almost like the air we breathe.
yeah.
The nature of knowledge is because we assume it to be explicit. It's almost like we can't see past that. And so I feel it's kind of our responsibility, people like us, Milad, to do what we're doing. I think the question of the contemplative questions are perhaps the most important because if we don't slow down, we don't return to the body and return to planet Earth and recognize our interrelatedness,
Yeah.
we continue to just extract. And
Yeah.
so,
Extract, consume, and be consumed.
right, right.
Kind of vicious cycle. I'm very well aware of that, and that's why I kind of try, despite everything, make time to be in silence, even alone, and in connection with nature. It's so important.
Mm,
So some of us have that chance, others don't get that chance at all. It's out of
mm,
their control. But it is, you're right, it's very, very important. And there's, to an extent, it's something we can do, not just you and I, but all of us can do to try and remember some of this and implement it in some way in our lives. There's no shortage of natural um, land and spaces in which we can enter and find that connection,
mm,
certainly. So that's good. It's just the knowledge and the motivation and I guess the remembrance, the sort of being always aware that now it's time. It's time to stop, time to step away, time to reconnect.
yeah,
That's very difficult. It's always been the fundamental challenge of practice, right?
yeah,
To
yeah.
change our habits, or rather the habits that are made for us because of the
Because
machine
of
we're in.
exactly, yes, the industry of education. But I think it's a good time for it because it seems that neuroscience understands metacognition as this sort of gold standard of learning, but really what that is knowing how you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's a great time for this return to recognizing and centering a little bit more in the tacit and valuing it, the
Mm.
tacit, because if we don't learn how to be responsible, mature, decent human beings, you know, if we don't value that as an end result of education, I'm not sure where we're going here. Um, yeah.
Well said. I agree with you 100%. You know that. And I think that's a great point to end on. I think if you don't mind me saying that this um, is very apt and it applies to everything in the sense of bringing the knowledge that I gained from your book into kind of like a full circle, real conversation in the real world. So it's sort of applying the theoretical to reality. And I can't thank you enough for sharing that with me and letting me be a part of that conversation with you. And again, tremendously delighted to have a conversation with you. And I was hoping that we could meet in person, but that time will come, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you, Milad. And again for taking the time that you do with these conversations. They really do they really honor the traditions and the knowledge by the depth and the time that you take with every conversation that you have on this podcast. And I know the work that you do as a teacher as well and as a scholar is honoring that. So uh,
Likewise.
yeah, may you be supported going forward to continue that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm,
Again, thank you so much for joining.
thank you.